Right then guys, it's PSL here for the second half of my 10 seasons of Dutch Grand Prix on F1 2020. It's the final spin-off video for my main all 10 seasons of my team career mode video on F1 2020, and we'll finally see who won at Zandvoort from season 6 to 10. What's quite interesting is that in the first part we saw 5 different drivers: Leclerc, Albon, Ricciardo, me, and then most recently Raikkonen win the first 5 races. With Kimi Raikkonen as the season 5 champion, I brought in George Russell, who had developed to be the 5th best driver in F1, yet he was still stuck at Williams. He was at 88 overall as standard, yet my team's facilities put him up to 99 permanently, and pre-season training tipped him over to 100 overall for the Dutch Grand Prix. Valtteri Bottas retired, which gave the second Mercedes seat to Kimi Raikkonen. Nick De Vries left Renault to take Russell's old spot at Williams. Nicholas Latifi went from Haas to Renault, and finally Guan Yu Zhou is the new 22nd driver in F1 as he went to fill the final vacant seat, which was at Haas. The only change to the pecking order from the 5th to 6th seasons was that Williams outdeveloped Alfa Romeo to have the 9th fastest car. Of course it isn't that simple, since the engine hierarchy changed as well. Mercedes' era with the dominant engine ended after just 1 season, and now it's Ferrari who have the best engine, and a perfect one at that. Honda still have the worst power unit, and whilst they've improved it, they're now even further behind the next 2 manufacturers.
Let's run you through the driver grid order for today's exciting race. George Russell did very well in qualifying yesterday and will start today's race from pole position. And Schumacher completes the front row. Looking at the rest of today's grid, we have Hamilton, Sainz, Kevin Magnussen and Ocon, Verstappen, Stroll, Norris and Daniel Kvyat, Perez, Raikkonen, Alexander Albon and Leclerc, Matsushita, Latifi, Antonio Giovinazzi and Pierre Gasly, Schumacher, Aitken, De Vries and Guan Yu Zhou.
It is worth mentioning that Max Verstappen gained 2 places at the start, jumping Ocon in a Ferrari off the grid and outbraking Magnussen to move up from 7th to 5th after just 1 corner. Meanwhile, Russell was so much faster than me that it was actually embarrassing, even if I was considerably quicker than everyone else. What's annoying is that I could understand Russell being miles quicker than me in qualifying or the race, but not both at the same time. I'm on a dry weather setup, so that explains completely why I'm struggling in the rain, but Russell did much better than me in the dry and is trouncing me in the wet as well. Before anyone needed a second set of inters, the track dried up enough for everyone to dive into the pits for slicks. The wise driver in this pit phase was Albon, as he stopped 1 lap earlier than most, jumping both Kvyat and Norris by timing the changeover to slicks perfectly to move up to 9th place. I'm sad to say, but that's pretty much the entire race, or certainly everything that needs to be talked about. As a case in point, Max Verstappen was clearly the quicker driver over the course of a whole lap, but the massive difference in power between the Renault and Honda engines meant he was never even close to pulling off a move on Carlos Sainz. The only other thing was that Alex Albon won driver of the day, and that's totally fair given that he started in 13th and finished in 8th, and he was pretty much the only driver to pass anyone outside of the first lap. Sure, it was mostly done through the pits, with his pass on Stroll for 8th being solely down to the fact that Red Bull's pit crew was faster than Racing Point's, but his decision to fit the dry tyres a lap earlier than the rest of the front runners was inspired. Up at the front, George Russell for PSL Racing won by 40 seconds, with me forming the back end of a Team 1-2, but I still crossed the line 17 seconds ahead of Hamilton. Hamilton and Sainz were stuck firm in 3rd and 4th, with Verstappen's exceptional start, meaning he saw the checkered flag in 5th. Magnussen for AlphaTauri and Ocon for Ferrari were able to keep ahead of Albon, with Stroll down in 9th and Norris in 10th. Leclerc and Raikkonen both had shockers given that their teammates scored points, with Raikkonen's new teammate even making it onto the podium. In the Finn's defence, 99 times out of 100, he absolutely would have retired by now. There was a rule change for the 7th season with chassis and durability departments both affected. Red Bull dropped behind their sister team as well as Ferrari from the start of the previous season to this one. Renault are now in front of McLaren and Alfa Romeo are back ahead of Williams. Only Honda improved the performance of their engine, but even still, it's still the least powerful. Other than that, the engines are the same as last year's, just less durable. Finally, driver changes, and I ditched the now world champion George Russell in favour of Jack Aitken, who, even with the facility and pre-season activity boosts, I could only up to 98 overall. Trust me though, he's still better than the 100 rated Raikkonen from seasons 4 and 5, as you'll soon see. In effect, Russell and Aitken swapped seats as Russell is now driving for Alfa Romeo. Weirdly, he went for them over the incredibly quick AlphaTauri team as they had an open space since Kevin Magnussen retired, but instead the team got Callum Ilott. Despite Racing Point only having the 8th best car and the joint 2nd best engine, Stroll was 2nd in a fully wet qualifying session and just 0.02 of a second clear of me. Jack Aitken was nearly a second clear of us in pole position, but he didn't start the first race of the season from the head of the grid, as Crofty will explain.
A fantastic effort from Lance Stroll yesterday puts him on pole position, and Schumacher completes the front row. Moving on to the rest of the grid, we have Hamilton, Verstappen, Daniel Kvyat and Ocon, Leclerc, Gasly, Albon and Lando Norris. Aitken, they've taken a grid penalty, Perez, Callum Ilott and Sainz, Raikkonen, Latifi, Antonio Giovinazzi and Nick de Vries, Joe, Russell, Matsushita and Mick Schumacher.
Aitken's penalty, an odd one given all of our car upgrades and the fact it's the very first race of the season, put me up to 2nd place, but it was a while before I took the lead of the race. It was a few laps, but DRS was key to getting myself in front of Stroll, but looking at how far back Hamilton, Kvyat and Verstappen are already, it's clear that Stroll is doing far better than those behind him. What's brilliant for me on a purely personal level is that Aitken couldn't clear Gasly in the Renault. That's good for me because, as qualifying showed, in clear air he's much quicker than me. So I need to pull out as big of a gap over him as possible before he clears the traffic, which seemingly is going to take a while. Meanwhile, Mercedes in their comparatively, especially when compared to my team, elderly driver lineup was slipping further and further back. Kvyat passed Hamilton for 3rd, which isn't horrendous in isolation, but then you've got Raikkonen, who already was running outside of the points, spinning and damaging his front wing. That dropped the Finn into 21st, that's 2nd to last. It took him a while, but Aitken finally made up some more ground, and at least he passed 2 drivers in one fell swoop. Both he and Gasly had DRS, whereas Albon was stuck there without it, and Albon had the least powerful engine in the back of his car. Aitken and Gasly both had a speed advantage on him, and Gasly went to the outside of Albon on the run to the first corner, with Aitken going past both of them to move up to 8th. Before the pits he cleared Ocon with ease, and his overcut strategy then meant he got some running in clear air. Staying out late meant he was on course to clear the likes of Vettel and Verstappen, who were amongst the first to pit and couldn't hold him up anymore. Stroll came in super early on the same lap as Verstappen and Vettel, which meant he fitted hard tyres. Compare that to Kvyat, who pitted a few laps later and was able to go onto the fresher and grippier mediums. Stroll just about maintained track position, but he held on to it for about half a lap before Kvyat with what is also likely the superior car despite the inferior engine, passed him for what is currently net second place. That said, the overcut didn't work for Hamilton, who lost places to Verstappen and Leclerc. But keep in mind, for the rest of the race, Hamilton is on mediums whereas Verstappen and Leclerc are on hards. Just before the halfway point of the race, Aitken took the bottom step of the podium off of Stroll, and with how quickly he's now cutting his way through the field, suddenly a win for me is far from guaranteed. The saving grace was how surprisingly tricky it was for Aitken to pass Kvyat, speaking to just how amazing that AlphaTauri is despite its power unit. Aitken passed Stroll at the start of lap 18, and here on lap 25 he got by Kvyat, but only for a few seconds, as traction and drive out of turn 1 saved Kvyat, along with some decent driving to be fair to him. It was almost exactly the same story on lap 27, but on the 30th lap, 10 laps after he first caught up to the back of Kvyat, Jack Aitken finally cleared him to form the back end of a PSL Racing 1-2. Thankfully, I kept hold of first place, and in doing so, became the first repeat winner at Zandvoort. Admittedly, that was entirely down to luck, with Aitken's grid penalty, as he was by far the fastest driver out there. Kvyat was the clear best of the rest, 8 seconds behind Aitken, but 16 ahead of Stroll. Verstappen, Leclerc and Ocon were all in the same region, and amazingly, all ahead of Hamilton. So Lewis Hamilton, the highest rated driver in the game and still at Mercedes, who have the second best car and engine, failed to catch up to Verstappen and Leclerc, and even lost the place to Ocon to cross the line in 8th. To be fair, Ferrari do have the most powerful engine, but a worse car on paper. Then again, AlphaTauri have the worst engine, only the third best car and lesser skilled drivers than Hamilton, yet Kvyat still finished on the podium. Then again, the other AlphaTauri driver of Callum Ilott was behind Hamilton, and finally Pierre Gasly just about scraped a couple of points. For the 8th season, there was a powertrain rule change which had a big effect on the engines. Not only did it change the hierarchy, but it also leveled the playing field, as 3 of the 4 suppliers were at 80 performance, Mercedes being the exception at 82, and that's why I went over to them. To top that off, Mercedes still have the best car apart from ours, so they should, especially given that one of their drivers is Lewis Hamilton, should be the clear next best team. Ferrari and AlphaTauri swapped places in the performance index, with Red Bull still in 5th. Renault sank from 6th to 9th, but all of the teams, with the exception of Mercedes and especially Haas, albeit at opposite ends of the table, have similarly quick cars. I bought in Calderon for reasons I explained in my all seasons of career mode video, and for the Dutch Grand Prix she was boosted up from 80 to 90 overall, and Jack Aitken amazingly wasn't able to find a new seat in F1. Sergio Setti Camara was though, as he joined Haas, since Mick Schumacher left them for Racing Point and Stroll left Racing Point for AlphaTauri. The correct move, even if his dad doesn't own that team.
Let's take a quick look at the grid lineup for today's race. Tatiana Calderon lines up on pole position, and Lando Norris lines up alongside. Looking down the rest of the grid, we have Kvyat, Verstappen, Schumacher and Stroll, Sainz, Ocon, Leclerc and Kimi Raikkonen, Latifi, Hamilton, Mick Schumacher and Perez, Giovinazzi, Albon, Pierre Gasly and Nick de Vries, Matsushita, Sete Camara, Joe and George Russell ends our grid lineup.
I can't spin it positively. Qualifying was bad for me, although that is down to the ever-increasing hidden difficulty from one season to the next. Luckily, within 13 seconds I overtook both Verstappen and Kvyat. Verstappen being passed under braking, and Kvyat I got by around the outside of the first corner. That put me up to 3rd and behind Lando Norris, and that opening lap was quite a messy one for me, given that I nearly lost the car and span, and then followed that up with a big lockup. That said, given enough of a run up, I was going to pass Norris easily, especially since he's only got the 6th best car, yet is still somehow the leading non-PSL Racing driver. Once again, AlphaTauri were quicker than their better funded sister team, both on paper and in actuality, as Lance Stroll got by Max Verstappen on the start-finish straight for 5th place, meaning it's now an AlphaTauri 4-5 with Kvyat still in 4th. Lance Stroll stopped incredibly early, being the first person to do so as he went onto the hard compound tyres. Meanwhile, his teammate Kvyat pitted a few laps later and went onto the quicker mediums, but that undercut by Stroll meant he jumped his new teammate for 4th place. Calderon set 2 new fastest laps after the pit phase, but seconds after she set her 2nd one in a row, I trumped it by half a second. Long the short of it, I was stuck outside of DRS range for a long time and lap traffic didn't help. Finally though, at the end of lap 23 I got DRS, which just ensured I was going to be close, because you need a gap of quite a bit less than a second to overtake someone in an identical car around this track. Thankfully, at the start of lap 28 I was able to get the move done down at the inside of turn 1 and, unlike how I pass everyone who isn't my teammate, I needed to do it on the brakes as raw horsepower wasn't quite enough. That was the entire race, and another PSL Racing 1-2 of me beating Calderon by 7 seconds come the end. A further 20 seconds back was Lando Norris. Who knows how he did that, given that he has a worse car than both Red Bull, AlphaTauri, Ferrari and Mercedes drivers. Stroll stayed ahead of Kvyat despite running on the harder tyres, with Sainz and the other McLaren in 6th. Verstappen ended the race in 7th, with both Ferraris led by Ocon in 8th and 9th, and Kimi Raikkonen for Mercedes was the last to score any points. Lewis Hamilton didn't break into the top 10 with the 2nd best car, yet Lando Norris finished on the podium with the 6th best. For the penultimate season there were only 2 driver changes, the first being that I brought Mick Schumacher back into the fold to finally give him a driver's championship, as well as maybe a Dutch Grand Prix victory as well. Calderon wasn't brought on by any other team, but with her out of F1, Jack Aitken came back and took Schumacher's old seat at Racing Point. There was also an aerodynamic and chassis rule change which had a profound effect on the pecking order, changing it from this to this. Then, just to add even more elements to the mix, the performance update was installed, which meant Racing Point were boosted up to having the 4th best car, having previously had the 8th best on paper, whilst Ferrari, who were already a shadow of their former selves, were weakened further. Also, Alfa Romeo dropped behind Williams and Haas were now in a woeful position. What doesn't help matters for them is that Ferrari have the worst engine as well, although all 4 suppliers improved on where they were last year. Renault and Mercedes are now on equal footing, but Honda have a maxed out engine. Only 5 performance separates all 4 suppliers, so there isn't a massive margin, but look at it another way, that's a spread 2.5 times greater than we saw last season.
Mick Schumacher lines up on pole position, and just starting behind them is Daniel Kvyat, who'll start from P2. Moving on to the rest of the grid, we have Schumacher, Hamilton, Charles Leclerc and Albon, Perez, Gasly, Stroll and Max Verstappen, Ocon, Raikkonen, Antonio Giovinazzi and Aitken, Russell, De Vries, Nobuharu Matsushita and Carlos Sainz, Norris, Joe, Latifi and Sergio Sette Camara.
As has often been the case in these races, qualifying let me down, but the race starts have saved me. Again, a better launch off the grid moved me up the order, passing Kvyat for 2nd place. Meanwhile, Mick Schumacher shot off. And I really mean that, since he was so much faster than me, demonstrated by the fact that at the end of the first lap I was 2 seconds behind him. the most experienced driver on the grid, who's also lucky enough to drive for Mercedes, made a mistake we've seen a few times previously. Too much power too early at the final chicane meant Kimi Räikkönen spam, but he was able to keep it out of the wall. Regardless, that error still dropped him from 13th to 18th. Albon stayed out for 2 laps longer than Hamilton before diving into the pits, meaning that he was able to change onto the mediums, whereas those who stopped earlier, including Hamilton, had to go for the hards to make the checkered flag. That overcut was what Albon needed to pass Hamilton for good and take 5th place. A faster tyre change by the Red Bull pit crew allowed Verstappen to pass sister teammate Stroll. But the good news for both of them is that a 2-lap overcut got both Verstappen and Stroll ahead of Pierre Gasly in the Renault. Again, both Verstappen and Stroll stopped for mediums and Gasly for hards. So Gasly lost track position and is on the slower tyres. How big of a mistake it was to pit for hards just at all in this race was shown when Albon got in front of Leclerc for 4th, with the Ferrari driver also making the error of pitting just a couple of laps too early. Honestly, if it wasn't for there being 3 different compounds of tyres, there would be very little to talk about from this race, as Perez benefited from the extra grip he had over Hamilton to pass the Mercedes driver for 6th place. What's fascinating is that Perez, in a racing point, the 4th best car on the grid, could pass Hamilton, yet Verstappen, in the 3rd best car, couldn't. Like Perez, he had the tyre advantage, and unlike Perez, he had a Honda engine, so should have had more straight line speed than Hamilton, never mind more than Perez as well. All that happened in the latter stages of the race was Schumacher lapping everyone except me. It was a truly dominant performance by Mick Schumacher, becoming the 7th different race winner at Zandvoort. I was comfortably in 2nd, then it's Kvyat in 3rd as he held off Albon to the very end. If you look at the race results though, logic would dictate that the race shouldn't have ended like that. Kvyat in 3rd with the 6th fastest car, Leclerc 5th with the 8th fastest car, Hamilton in 7th and Räikkönen in 14th with the best car, apart from PSL Racing's. In fairness, how quick each of the cars were in the race mostly reflected what the performance index says. It's just qualifying really was random and the track isn't open enough for the grid to fully right itself. Then again, this isn't the first time that's been the case. That's pretty much it. Well, there is the 10th season's Dutch Grand Prix, but I already did a proper summary of that race in the Ragunathan video, so if you want to know in detail what happened, then watch that video. But the main highlights are, to begin with, I brought in Ragunathan as my new teammate and I was able to boost him up to 76 overall in time for the race. The engines stayed the same as they were the previous year, but the team pecking order had changed. But just a quick note that Racing Point had the 6th best car. That didn't stop Mick Schumacher and Jack Aitken taking the Silverstone based team to 1st and 3rd in qualifying though. The game also proved to get even harder as I qualified in 6th with Ragunathan 9th. Long the short of it, I won partly thanks to being much more competitive in the race, but also an early stop by Schumacher meant I jumped him and it stopped Stroll from getting DRS, so then I could pass the Canadian for 1st place. Stroll was on course to cross the line in 2nd, but a car issue caused him to fall down the order, eventually ending the race in 7th and behind his teammate. Ragunathan though had a spellbinding race, moving up from 9th to his finishing position of 5th. It's poor when compared to me, but he was almost on a par with the rest of the front runners and he was able to overtake others on track. If you watched my Ragunathan video though, you'll know just how much he was helped by those pre-season boosts to his attributes. This was by far his best performance, and even then I'd say it's on the lower bounds of acceptable. With Stroll dropping down the order due to car troubles, it was Carlos Sainz and Mick Schumacher who joined me on the podium, with Sergio Perez in the other McLaren in 4th, and then it's Mahavir Ragunathan in 5th. Both PSL Racing cars beat both AlphaTauris, which is an incredibly rare feat this season. Max Verstappen, Jack Aitken and Lando Norris completed the points positions. Of course, if you want to see Ragunathon's full stint with my team and how that played out, be sure to watch that video, and if you want to know more about my 10 season long My Team career, then there's also that video available for you to watch. If you've seen all 4 of my F1 2020 all seasons of My Team career mode videos, then thank you very much. And I'll see you in several months' time when I do all of this again on F1 2021.